You can love someone with your whole chest and still be terrified every single day. That's the part nobody tells you. They say love is supposed to feel safe. But if you've ever laid awake at 2 a.m. running through every way you could lose the person next to you, you already know the truth. Love and fear moved in together a long time ago, and most of us never noticed when it happened. Here's the part that sounds wrong at first. The fear isn't there because you love too much. It's there because you're gripping too hard. And those are two completely different things. This video is about a way of loving that doesn't collapse the moment you imagine losing it. Not a trick, not a mindset hack. A different relationship with holding all together. One that ancient teachers understood long before modern psychology gave it fancy names. By the end, you'll understand why the very thing you think protects your love is actually what's slowly suffocating it. Most people carry love like a bag of stones on their back. Every good memory, every fear of loss, every what if they leave, every comparison to the last person who hurt you, it all gets added to the pile, and you carry it everywhere, into new relationships, into old ones, into moments that should feel light, but instead feel like your knees are buckling under something you can't even name. You tell yourself this weight is love, that the heaviness proves how much you care. But ask yourself honestly, does carrying that weight make you love better, or does it just make you tired? Does it bring you closer to the person in front of you, or does it pull your attention into a future that hasn't happened yet, and a past that's already gone? That's the real problem, not that you love, that you've confused holding on tightly with loving deeply. And once you see the difference, you can't unsee it. The weight you mistake for devotion. There's a strange kind of pride people take in how much they worry about the ones they love. As if the anxiety itself is proof of the bond. As if the sleepless nights, the constant checking, the endless rehearsing of worst-case scenarios somehow add up to something noble. Somewhere along the way, we started measuring love by how much it costs us to feel it. The more it hurts, the more it must mean. The more it keeps us up at night, the more real it must be. But watch closely, because this is where the confusion starts. Worry doesn't protect anyone. It never has. It just adds another stone to the bag you're already carrying. And you don't even notice the weight building, because you've been told your whole life that this is simply what love looks like. Think about a parent who checks their child's location every 10 minutes throughout the day, watching the little dot move across a screen, refreshing it again and again, even when nothing is wrong, even when the child is exactly where they said they'd be. That parent isn't loving more than a parent who trusts their child can handle the world. They're not more devoted. They're not more careful. They're simply carrying more weight and calling it care, because it's easier to call it care than to admit it's fear wearing a parent's face. This happens in every kind of relationship, not just between parents and children. It happens between partners who check each other's phones, between friends who need constant reassurance that the friendship is still solid, between siblings who compete over who worries more, as if worry were a currency of love instead of a symptom of fear. We've built an entire culture around the idea that suffering for someone proves you love them, that if it doesn't hurt, it isn't real. But here's a question worth sitting with. Does carrying that weight make you love better? Does it make you more present with the person in front of you, or does it pull your mind somewhere else entirely, into a future that hasn't happened, into a past that's already gone, into 100 imagined scenarios that exist nowhere except inside your own head? When you're gripped by worry, are you actually with the person you claim to be worried about, or are you somewhere far away, wrestling with a version of them that only exists in your fear? This is the trap. Worry feels like love because it's loud. It demands your attention. It keeps you up, keeps your chest tight, keeps your thoughts circling. And because it feels so intense, we assume it must be meaningful. But intensity and meaning are not the same thing. A storm is intense. That doesn't make it nourishing. A fire is intense. That doesn't mean it's warmth you want to sit beside for long. Real devotion doesn't need to strain under its own weight to prove that it's real. It doesn't need to announce itself through anxiety. It moves lighter than that, quieter than that. And because it's quieter, we sometimes mistake it for something less than what it is. There's an old image worth carrying with you here, the difference between someone carrying water in cupped hands and someone clutching it in a closed fist. Picture both of them standing at a well, filling their hands with water, then walking a short distance to where they need to bring it. The one with open cupped hands moves carefully, aware of the water resting there, present with each step, adjusting their pace to keep as much of it as possible. The one with the closed fist squeezes tighter and tighter, certain that gripping harder means holding on better. But watch what actually happens. The one with the open hands arrives with water still cupped inside their palms. The one with the clenched fist arrives with nothing but a wet, aching hand, because the water escaped through the cracks between fingers the entire way, squeezed out by the very effort meant to keep it in. This is what fear does to love. It convinces you that gripping tighter is protection, when really, it's the thing causing the loss. Every time you interrogate someone out of insecurity, you're squeezing the fist a little tighter. Every time you demand proof of loyalty that can never actually satisfy the fear underneath it, you're squeezing tighter. Every time you replay an argument at 2 a.m., turning it over and over looking for the exact moment things went wrong, you're squeezing tighter. And all that gripping doesn't hold love in place. It exhausts you, and it exhausts the person you're gripping, until eventually there's nothing left to hold on to, except the ache in your own hand. Devotion that's real doesn't need to strain like this. It can hold something completely, fully, wholly, without holding back, and still stay open. This is hard to imagine if you've only ever known the clenched fist version of love, because openness can feel like carelessness when you're used to equating tightness with commitment. But openness isn't the absence of care. It's care without the panic attached to it. It's choosing someone every day without needing to choke the choice into permanence through sheer force of grip. Consider how this plays out in ordinary moments, the ones that don't feel dramatic but quietly shape a relationship over years. A partner leaves for a work trip, and one version of you spends the whole week anxious, checking their location, reading into every delayed text, building a small case in your mind about what their silence might mean. Another version of you, the version with open hands, trusts the space between you the way you'd trust a bridge you've walked across 100 times before. You miss them, you still love them just as much. But you're not spending the whole week bracing for collapse. You're living your days instead of surviving them. The wait you mistake for devotion isn't devotion at all. It's fear that learned to dress up in devotion's clothing, because fear needed somewhere respectable to hide. And the tragedy is that this fear doesn't even accomplish what it sets out to do. It doesn't keep people closer. It doesn't prevent loss. It just makes the time you do have together heavier than it needs to be, and it teaches the people you love that being loved by you means being watched, tested, and held onto with a grip that leaves marks. If you've spent years believing that anxious attachment is simply what deep love feels like, this might be uncomfortable to hear. It might even feel like you're being asked to care less. But that's not what's being asked of you here. You're being asked to notice the difference between the water in your hands and the fist around your fingers. You're being asked to notice that the goal was never to hold on as tightly as possible. The goal was always to keep the water. And the way you keep water is not by squeezing it. It's by opening your hands enough to let it rest there, trusting that presence, not pressure, is what keeps it close. There's also a quieter cost to this weight that rarely gets talked about, and it has nothing to do with the relationship itself. It has to do with what carrying that bag of stones does to the person carrying it. Fear disguised as devotion doesn't just strain the bond between two people. It strains the one doing the worrying. Ask anyone who has spent years in a state of low-grade panic about losing someone, and they'll tell you about the exhaustion that settles into the body over time. The tight shoulders, the shallow breathing, the way their mind never fully rests, even in good moments, because some part of them is always scanning for the next threat. This is not what love was supposed to cost. Love was supposed to add something to your life, not slowly drain it, while convincing you the draining is proof of how much you care. And there's one more thing worth noticing before we move forward. The people on the receiving end of this kind of devotion can usually feel it, even if they can't name it. They can feel the difference between being loved and being watched. Being loved feels like room to breathe. Being watched feels like an exam you never signed up to take. Over time, people start to shrink around that kind of watching. They stop sharing the small, honest things. Not because they're hiding something, but because honesty starts to feel dangerous when every word gets studied for hidden meaning. This is the quiet damage that fear does when it's mistaken for devotion. It doesn't just wear down the one gripping the fist, it slowly teaches the other person that closeness comes with surveillance attached. And once that lesson is learned, it takes a long time to unlearn, even after the fist finally opens. Why losing feels like dying. When you imagine losing someone you love, some part of your body reacts like you're about to die. Your chest tightens, your stomach drops, your breathing changes without you even choosing it to. This isn't dramatic exaggeration or poetic language meant to make a point sound bigger than it is. It's biology, plain and simple. Attachment wires itself into your nervous system as a matter of survival. The same system that once kept your ancestors close to their tribe, because being alone in the wild meant a much higher chance of not making it through the season. Your body doesn't fully know the difference between losing a companion 10,000 years ago and losing a partner today. To your nervous system, both feel like a threat to your continued existence, and it reacts accordingly, flooding you with the same chemicals it would use to help you run from danger. But here's what almost nobody tells you, and it's the part that changes everything once you actually sit with it. That reaction is about your fear, not about your love. These are two very different things that have been fused together for so long that most people never think to separate them. Two people can love each other exactly the same amount, genuinely, deeply, without a shred of difference in the sincerity of their care. Yet one of them carries this dread like a second skin every single day, and the other doesn't carry it at all. If the love is equal, then the difference has to be coming from somewhere else. And it is. It's coming from what each of them believes love requires them to hold on to, and how tightly they believe they need to hold it. Think about two people who both love their partner deeply. One of them wakes up most mornings with a low hum of anxiety in the background, a subtle bracing that something could go wrong today. The other wakes up and simply loves the day and the person beside them, without that hum running underneath everything. It's not that the second person cares less. It's not that they've somehow achieved a lower standard of love. It's that somewhere along the way, the first person learned to fuse their sense of safety to another human being, and the second person didn't. That fusion is what turns ordinary love into something that feels like it could kill you if it ended. This is worth sitting with honestly, because it asks something uncomfortable of you. If losing someone feels like losing a piece of yourself, not metaphorically, but in a way that actually feels like your identity would crack open if they left, That's worth noticing. Not to shame yourself for it. Shame never fixed anything. It just adds another stone to the same bag we've been talking about. This is simply about noticing, the way you'd notice a splinter before deciding what to do about it. Because when your sense of self gets fused to another person, every fear about them becomes a fear about your own survival. Their late text isn't just a late text anymore. It becomes a referendum on whether you're safe in the world. Their bad mood isn't just a bad mood. It becomes evidence that the ground beneath you might be shifting. This fusion often forms so early and so quietly that most people never remember it happening. Maybe it started in childhood, when a caregiver's love felt inconsistent, and your nervous system learned that closeness had to be earned and guarded constantly, or it might disappear. Maybe it started in an earlier relationship, where someone did leave, unexpectedly, and some part of you decided that letting your guard down again would be foolish. Wherever it started, the result is the same. You stop experiencing love as something that adds to who you are, and you start experiencing it as something that has become who you are. And anything that has become you is terrifying to imagine losing, because losing it doesn't feel like losing a relationship. It feels like losing yourself. Here's the important distinction though, the one that can quietly change how you carry every relationship going forward. That's not romance. That's dependency wearing romance's clothes. Real romance, the kind that doesn't collapse into panic at the first sign of distance, includes two people who love each other while still remaining two whole people. Not two halves that need each other to be complete, but two complete individuals who choose to walk alongside one another. When you are whole on your own, losing someone still hurts. Grief is real, and it should be honored, never minimized, but it doesn't threaten your survival. It doesn't feel like the floor disappearing beneath you. It feels like loss, which is painful and human, but survivable, because you were never actually dependent on them for your sense of existing in the first place. This distinction matters because it changes what you're actually working on. If you think the goal is to love less so it hurts less, you'll end up building walls instead of boundaries, distancing yourself as a form of self-protection that ultimately robs you of the very closeness you were trying to preserve. But if you understand that the goal is to rebuild your sense of self so it doesn't depend on another person's presence to feel steady, you can love just as fully, maybe even more fully, without carrying that underlying dread everywhere you go. You get to keep the depth of the love while releasing the terror that's been riding alongside it. Consider what it might feel like to separate these two things in your own life. To notice, the next time your chest tightens at the thought of losing someone, whether what you're feeling is grief for a person you care about, or fear for a version of yourself that doesn't know how to exist without them. These feel identical in the body at first, but they are not the same, and only one of them is actually about love. The other is about survival, dressed up so convincingly as love that it's taken you this long to notice the disguise. None of this means the fear is your fault, or that you're broken for feeling it. It simply means the fear was never proof of how much you love someone. It was proof of how tightly your sense of self had become tangled with theirs. And once you begin gently untangling that, not by loving less, but by becoming more whole on your own, losing someone stops feeling like dying. It starts feeling like what it actually is, one of the hardest, most human experiences there is, but one you can walk through and survive, because you are always whole enough to survive it, even if fear spent years convincing you otherwise. There's a quiet kind of freedom hiding inside this realization, one that doesn't show itself right away. When you stop needing someone's presence to feel like a solid ground under your feet, you actually become more present with them, not less. You stop scanning them for signs of departure. You stop rehearsing the speech you'd give if they ever left. Your attention, which used to be split between the person in front of you and the fear standing just behind your shoulder finally gets to belong fully to the moment you're actually in. And strangely, this is often what makes a bond stronger, not weaker. Because people can feel the difference between being loved by someone who is complete and being loved by someone who is holding on to them for dear life. One feels like companionship, the other feels like a weight being quietly transferred, stone by stone, without either person fully realizing it's happening. The difference between holding and grasping. Picture holding a bird in your hands. It's a small, warm, living thing. Its heartbeat faster than yours. Its whole body trembling slightly, with the effort of trusting you enough to stay still. If you grasp it too tightly, out of fear that it might fly away, you crush the very thing you were trying to protect. The tighter your fingers close, the more the bird struggles, and the more it struggles, the more you squeeze, until the thing you loved enough to want to keep close is broken by the very act meant to keep it near. And if you hold it too loosely, afraid of squeezing too hard, it flies off before you're even ready to let it go, startled by the lack of steadiness in your hands. But if you hold it with steady, open hands, not gripping, not careless, just present and attentive, it can rest there peacefully, or it can leave when it's ready, and either way your hands remain unharmed, and so does the bird. Most people only know one way to hold love, and it's the grasping way. It's the way that squeezes tighter the moment fear shows up. Squeeze tighter when scared. Check the phone one more time, even though you already checked it 5 minutes ago, and nothing has changed except your own anxiety. Replay the argument from last week until it makes sense, turning the same handful of sentences over and over in your mind, looking for a different meaning that might finally let you rest, except it never does, because the argument was never really the thing keeping you awake. Demand reassurance that can never actually be enough, because the fear was never really about the reassurance in the first place. It was about the grip. Reassurance is water poured into a cup with a hole in the bottom. No matter how much you pour in, it drains right back out, because the hole isn't in the cup, it's in the grip. This is one of the cruelest tricks fear plays on people who are trying their best to love well. It convinces you that if you just get enough proof, enough certainty, enough confirmation that the person isn't going anywhere, the fear will finally settle down and let you rest. So you ask again. You seek the reassurance again. And for a moment, it works. The fear quiets, just slightly, just long enough for you to feel a flicker of relief. But the relief never lasts, because the fear was never actually about the specific question you asked. It was about the grip itself, the belief that safety has to be manufactured through control, checked and rechecked like a lock you're never quite sure you turned. Loving with open hands doesn't mean loving less. This is the part people misunderstand the most, because they've spent so long equating tightness with commitment that openness feels, at first, like indifference. It feels like giving up, like admitting you don't care enough to hold on. But open hands are not empty hands. They are simply hands that aren't clenched, hands that can still hold something completely without crushing it, hands that can feel the weight and warmth of what they're holding without needing to prove their devotion through pressure. It means finally loving in a way where fear isn't doing the holding for you, where you're the one choosing to stay present, not fear forcing you to stay vigilant. Think about what it actually looks like to hold someone with open hands in daily life. It looks like trusting them enough to let a delayed reply be just a delayed reply, not evidence of something sinister. It looks like allowing them their own friendships, their own private thoughts, their own moments of distance, without interpreting every bit of space as a threat to the relationship. It looks like being able to disagree with someone you love, without spiraling into a fear that the disagreement means the whole thing is ending. It looks like saying what you need, clearly, once, and then trusting the relationship enough not to need to say it 5 more times in 5 different ways, testing to see if the answer changes. Open-handed love also looks like being able to sit with uncertainty without needing to resolve it immediately. Relationships, by their nature, involve uncertainty. You cannot know for certain what someone else will do tomorrow or in 10 years, no matter how many questions you ask or how much reassurance you gather. The grasping mind cannot tolerate this uncertainty. It treats every unanswered question as an emergency that must be solved right now, tonight, before sleep is even possible. But the open-handed mind has learned to let uncertainty exist without turning it into an emergency. It can hold the truth that nothing is guaranteed and still choose to love fully within that truth, rather than trying to grip tightly enough to force a guarantee that was never available to begin with. There is also something important to notice about what grasping actually does to the space between two people. A grip, by its very nature, takes up room. It presses in. It leaves marks. Even when it comes from a place of genuine love, grasping communicates something to the person on the receiving end. It tells them their presence is being monitored, their movements accounted for, their trustworthiness constantly under quiet review. Over time, this changes how people show up in a relationship. They begin to shrink their own honesty, not because they have anything to hide, but because openness starts to feel unsafe when everything gets studied for hidden meaning. Ironically, the grip meant to keep someone close is often the very thing that teaches them to keep parts of themselves at a distance. Open hands, by contrast, create room. They don't press in. They don't leave marks. And in that room, something is able to breathe that couldn't breathe under pressure. Trust, honesty, the small daily choice to stay, made freely rather than extracted through fear. This is the part that's easy to miss when you've only ever known the grasping way of loving. You assume that loosening your grip will mean losing what you're holding. But often, the opposite is true. The bird that's held gently is far more likely to choose to stay than the bird that's clutched until it can't breathe. Not because gentleness manipulates them into staying, but because gentleness simply doesn't give them a reason to want to leave. Learning to hold with open hands instead of a closed fist isn't a single decision you make once and then have mastered forever. It's a practice, something you return to again and again, especially in the moments when fear rises up and tells you that gripping tighter is the only way to keep something safe. It takes noticing the urge to check, to test, to demand proof, and choosing instead to simply stay present, trusting that presence itself, steady, attentive, warm, is a far stronger form of holding than any grip could ever be. The water stays in cupped hands, not because the hands refuse to let it go, but because they've stopped fighting the shape of what holding was always meant to look like. You will slip back into the grip sometimes. Everyone does. Fear doesn't disappear just because you've understood it intellectually. It visits again on hard days, in quiet moments, whenever an old wound gets brushed against. The goal isn't to never feel the pull toward gripping again. The goal is to notice it sooner each time, to recognize the tightening in your chest and the tightening in your hands as the same old habit trying to convince you it's protection, and to gently loosen your fingers anyway. Not because the fear is wrong to exist, but because you've finally learned what it takes so long to learn, that love was never meant to be squeezed into staying. It was only ever meant to be offered, openly, and trusted to find its own way to remain. What you're really afraid of. Ask yourself honestly, are you afraid of losing them, or are you afraid of what their absence would say about you? This question sounds simple at first, almost too simple to matter. but sit with it a little longer, and it starts to open something up. Are you afraid of the silence in the house, or the mirror that silence would force you to look into? Because those are two very different fears. Even though they feel identical when they show up at 2 a.m., tightening your chest and pulling your thoughts into a spiral you can't seem to climb out of. One fear is about them. The other fear is about you. And most people never take the time to separate the two, so they spend years believing they're afraid of losing a person, when really they're afraid of being left alone with themselves. A lot of what we call fear of loss is really fear of being left alone with ourselves. This is uncomfortable to hear, and it should be, because comfortable truths rarely change anything. If someone else's presence has become the thing that quiets the noise in your own head, then their absence doesn't just mean missing them. It means the noise coming back, loud and unfiltered, with nothing there to drown it out anymore. That's a heavier burden than any relationship should have to carry, and yet so many relationships end up carrying exactly that weight, silently, without either person naming what's actually happening. Think about what it might mean if you noticed, honestly, that the panic you feel at the thought of losing someone isn't really about missing their laugh, or their presence at the dinner table, or the specific person they are. Think about whether some of that panic is actually about facing an empty house, an empty evening, an empty version of yourself that you've spent years avoiding by staying busy inside someone else's life. This doesn't mean you don't love them. It doesn't cancel out the real affection, the real connection, the real years built together. But it does mean that some portion of the fear you've been calling love was never actually about them at all. It was about what their presence has been doing for you, quieting a silence you were never quite brave enough to sit inside alone. This is uncomfortable to admit, and it should stay uncomfortable for a while, because sitting with discomfort, honestly, is how you finally start telling the difference between the two fears. But sit with it anyway, because once you can name what you're actually afraid of, something shifts. You stop asking your partner, your friend, your family member to carry weight that was never theirs to hold in the first place. You stop needing them to constantly prove they're not leaving, because you realize the real fear was never really about whether they'd leave. It was about whether you'd be okay if they did, and that question was never theirs to answer for you. Consider how this shows up in small, ordinary moments. Someone doesn't text back for a few hours, and the panic that rises isn't really about wondering if something happened to them. It's about the sudden confrontation with unstructured time, alone, with your own thoughts, without a conversation to distract you from whatever's been sitting quietly underneath the noise of daily life. Someone needs a night to themselves, and the hurt that follows isn't really about missing their company for one evening. It's about what that evening alone forces you to face. The parts of yourself you've been outsourcing to their presence instead of learning to hold on your own. This pattern often starts long before the relationship you're in now. Maybe you grew up in a home where being alone felt unsafe, where silence meant something was wrong, where the absence of noise and company was never peaceful but something closer to abandonment. If that's true, it makes sense that your body would treat someone else's absence as a threat, because somewhere deep in your nervous system, being alone got wired to mean being unsafe. That wiring isn't your fault, but recognizing it is the beginning of changing it, because you cannot ask someone else's constant presence to permanently patch over a wound that was formed long before they arrived. There's a difference between missing someone and being unable to function without them, and that difference is worth learning to feel in your own body. Missing someone is soft. It has an ache to it, but it's an ache you can carry while still being a whole person, still going about your day, still finding moments of peace even inside the missing. Being unable to function without someone is sharper, more frantic, more like drowning than aching. If your fear of losing someone feels less like an ache and more like drowning, that's worth paying attention to, not with judgment, but with honesty. It's telling you that some part of your foundation has been resting on their presence instead of on your own 2 feet. Facing this doesn't mean withdrawing from love or building distance as a form of protection. It means slowly, patiently, building a relationship with your own company that's strong enough to hold you, even on the hardest days, even in the quietest houses. It means learning to sit in silence without needing to fill it immediately, learning to spend an evening alone without treating it like an emergency, learning to trust that you can survive your own thoughts instead of needing someone else's voice to drown them out permanently. This isn't quick work, and it isn't meant to be done alone in the sense of having no support. Therapy, friendships, community, all of these can help. But it does mean the work has to happen inside you, not inside someone else's constant availability. When you finally start doing this work, something remarkable happens to your relationships. You stop needing people to prove they're staying, because you're no longer terrified of what would happen if they didn't. You start loving from a place of genuine desire, instead of desperate need, and those 2 things feel completely different, both to you and to the person receiving your love. Desperate need clings, tests, and exhausts. Genuine desire chooses, again and again, freely, without the undertone of panic running beneath it. And the strange gift hidden inside all of this is that when you stop being afraid of being alone with yourself, losing someone stops feeling like losing your entire foundation. It starts feeling like what it actually is, a real loss, painful and worth grieving, but survivable, because you were never actually as dependent on their presence as fear had convinced you that you were. There's one more layer worth naming here, and it's the part that often gets missed entirely. When you finally separate the fear of losing them from the fear of facing yourself, you also free the relationship from an unfair job it was never equipped to do. No person, no matter how loving, no matter how devoted, can be responsible for holding your entire sense of peace together. That's not a flaw in them. It's simply not a role any human being can sustainably fill for another. The moment you stop asking someone to be the only thing standing between you and your own silence, you give them room to be a person again, instead of a life raft you're clinging to in open water. And you give yourself room to become the kind of person who can stand steady on their own, which, quietly, is often the very thing that makes you easier to love in the first place. The burden you didn't know you were handing someone. Here's something that stings a little, and it's worth letting it sting instead of rushing past it. When you love someone from a place of fear, you don't just carry the weight yourself. You hand pieces of it to them too, often without ever meaning to, often without even realizing it's happening, until years have passed and the pattern has become so familiar it feels invisible. Every accusation born from insecurity lands on them, even when the accusation was really about something that happened long before they entered your life. Every test, disguised as a question, the casual sounding, "Where were you?" that's really searching for a crack, the "Who was that?" that's really hunting for betrayal that hasn't occurred, lands on them too. Every silence used as punishment, the cold shoulder that's meant to communicate hurt, but instead just communicates distance, lands on them as well. And slowly, without either person fully noticing, they start carrying a bag that isn't even theirs, filled with stones from every person who hurt you before them. This is one of the hardest truths to sit with, because it means the fear you've been carrying doesn't stay contained inside you. It doesn't stay quiet in the corner of your own mind, hurting only you. It leaks outward, into the relationship, into the person you claim to be protecting through your vigilance. The very fear that convinces you it's keeping love safe is often the thing quietly poisoning it. One small test at a time, one accusation at a time, one cold silence at a time. And the person receiving all of this rarely understands where it's actually coming from, because you don't always understand it yourself in the moment. They just feel the weight land on them over and over, and they start adjusting their behavior to avoid triggering it, walking a little more carefully, explaining themselves a little more than should be necessary, shrinking just slightly to keep the peace. This is how fear quietly poisons even the most sincere love. Not through malice. This is important to understand, because most people doing this are not cruel, not manipulative, not trying to hurt anyone. They are simply scared, and scared people, without meaning to, often pass their fear onto whoever is closest to them, because fear needs somewhere to go, and the nearest person becomes the most convenient place to put it. Not through malice, but through weight, passed hand to hand, generation to generation, relationship to relationship, until someone finally decides to put the bag down instead of passing it on. Think about where your own fear first learned its shape. Maybe someone before this person broke a promise you didn't see coming, and some part of you decided that trust had to be earned through constant testing from then on. Maybe a parent's love felt inconsistent, present one day and cold the next, and you learned early that closeness had to be monitored carefully, or it might disappear without warning. Whatever the origin, the stones in your bag were collected long before this relationship began. And if you're not careful, if you don't stop to notice where those stones actually came from, you'll keep handing them to whoever stands closest to you, expecting them to somehow answer for wounds they had no part in creating. This is often the moment where a relationship quietly starts to crack, not through one dramatic betrayal, but through the slow accumulation of unfair weight. The partner who gets interrogated for a delayed text they had no control over. The friend who gets tested repeatedly to prove their loyalty, even after they've already proven it 100 times before. The family member who gets punished with silence for a slight that was mostly imagined, born more from an old wound than from anything they actually did. Each of these moments feels small on its own, almost forgettable. But stones are small too, and a bag full of small stones still weighs enough to break someone's back if they carry it long enough. The hardest part of this to accept is that noticing this pattern requires you to stop mid-fear and ask yourself an honest question. Is this feeling actually about what's happening right now, or is it about something older that's simply been triggered by this moment? This is not easy to do in the heat of a spiraling thought at midnight. It takes practice, and it takes humility, because it means admitting that some of what you've been calling trust issues, or just being cautious, is actually old pain looking for a new place to land. It means admitting that the person in front of you might be innocent of the very thing you've been quietly accusing them of for months or years. But here is where the real freedom lives, both for you and for the person you love. The moment you can catch yourself mid-test, mid-accusation, mid-cold silence, and pause long enough to ask whether this stone actually belongs to them, you begin the slow work of putting the bag down instead of passing it forward. This doesn't mean pretending the fear doesn't exist. It means taking responsibility for where it came from, instead of quietly making someone else responsible for carrying it. It means telling someone, honestly, I'm feeling scared right now, and I don't think it's fully about you, instead of turning that fear into an accusation dressed up as a question. This kind of honesty is harder than testing someone, harder than interrogating them, harder than punishing them with silence. It requires you to sit with your own fear directly instead of rooting it through someone else's behavior. But it's also the only way the pattern actually breaks. Because as long as the fear keeps finding somewhere else to land, it never has to be faced. It just keeps getting handed off, bag to bag, relationship to relationship, generation to generation, until someone, somewhere, finally stops and says, "This weight ends with me. I will not hand this to the next person who loves me." And in that decision, small and quiet as it might seem, an entire, inherited pattern begins to lose its grip, not with one dramatic breakthrough, but with each small stone you finally choose to carry yourself, instead of placing it into someone else's open, trusting hands. There's something worth noticing about what happens on the other side of this shift, too. When you stop handing your fear to the people you love, you often discover they were more patient with you than you gave them credit for, and more willing to meet you honestly than any test could have ever proven. Tests only ever measure whether someone can pass a test. They don't measure trust, or safety, or love. Honesty measures something real. When you tell someone the truth about your fear, instead of disguising it as an accusation, you give them the chance to actually show up for you, rather than simply defend themselves against something they didn't do. And more often than people expect, that honesty is met with tenderness, instead of the rejection fear always warned you to expect. Not because the fear was foolish for existing, but because it had simply been given the wrong outlet for far too long. This is slow work, and it rarely feels finished. You will still feel the old pull sometimes, the urge to test instead of trust, to accuse instead of ask. But each time you catch it a little sooner, name it a little more honestly, and choose to carry your own weight instead of quietly transferring it, you are doing something that very few people ever learn to do. You are breaking a chain that likely stretches back further than you know. One stone, one honest conversation, one moment of self-awareness at a time. Impermanence isn't the enemy. Nothing you have ever loved was promised to stay. Say that sentence slowly, and notice what happens in your chest. For most people, there's an immediate resistance, a flinch, a desire to argue against it, to point to the exceptions, the relationships that lasted a lifetime, the friendships that survived decades. But even those relationships were never actually promised. They simply happened to last, through effort and circumstance and a fair amount of luck, and even then, they existed inside a larger truth that nothing escapes, that everything which lives changes. Not because the universe is cruel, not because love is designed to fail, but because change is simply the nature of anything that breathes. Think of a mountain. It looks permanent, doesn't it? Something so massive, so ancient, so unmoved by the passing of a single human lifetime that it seems almost insulting to call it temporary. And yet the mountain you saw yesterday isn't the exact mountain you'll see tomorrow. Wind is reshaping it, even now, grain by grain, too slowly for your eyes to catch, too slowly for anyone to notice within a single lifetime, but reshaping it nonetheless. Rain is carving new lines into stone that will, eventually, in a timescale beyond human comprehension, turn that mountain into something else entirely, smaller, different, eventually gone. If something as vast and solid as a mountain isn't exempt from change, what made you think a relationship, built from something as fragile and shifting as two human hearts, ever could be? People are the same as that mountain, just moving on a timescale you can actually witness. They shift, they grow. Sometimes they leave, choosing a different path than the one that once ran alongside yours. And sometimes they stay, physically present in your life for years or decades, but slowly become someone slightly different from who you fell in love with. Not through betrayal, not through any wrongdoing, but simply through the natural unfolding of a human life. The person who held your hand 10 years ago has had 10 more years of experiences reshaping them since then, just as you have. Expecting them to remain frozen exactly as they were is like expecting the mountain to stay unchanged by the wind. It's not how anything that lives actually works. The instinct, when faced with this truth, is to fight it, to grip harder, hoping stillness will make it permanent. This is where so much unnecessary suffering gets built into relationships that could otherwise be peaceful. People sense the shifting nature of love and life, and instead of moving with it, they brace against it, trying to hold their partner, their friend, their family member in a fixed position, as if enough effort could stop time itself. But permanence was never on the table. It never was, not for this relationship, not for any relationship, not for anything that has ever existed inside the flow of time. Trying to force permanence onto something that was never built to hold it is like trying to dam a river with your bare hands. You might slow it for a moment, exhausting yourself in the process, but the water finds its way through eventually, because that is simply what water does, and what time does, and what love does when it's alive rather than frozen in place. What was always on the table, though, and this is the part worth holding on to tightly, was presence. Not permanence, but presence. And presence is available to you right now, in this exact moment, regardless of what happens next. This is not a consolation prize offered instead of the permanence you actually wanted. It's the only thing that was ever real to begin with. The mountain doesn't spend its existence mourning the version of itself it will eventually become. It simply is, in each moment, exactly as it is right now, weathering what comes, standing where it stands, being fully present in its own slow unfolding. There's something worth learning from that, even though a mountain cannot teach you directly, even though it cannot speak, even though its lesson is simply written into the shape of its own existence. Consider what it might mean to actually live inside this truth, rather than fighting it. It means noticing, really noticing, the ordinary Tuesday evening with someone you love, instead of letting your attention drift toward worrying about some future Tuesday when they might not be there. It means appreciating a friendship exactly as it is today, instead of measuring its worth by how many more years it might last. It means loving someone as they are right now, this version of them, rather than mourning the version they used to be or bracing for the version they might become. This is not naive optimism that ignores the reality of loss. It's the opposite. It's a clear-eyed acceptance of impermanence that actually allows you to love more fully within it, rather than spending your limited time together half-present, distracted by a fear of an ending that hasn't arrived yet and might not arrive for years. There's a kind of grief that happens in advance, a preemptive mourning that some people carry every single day of a relationship, quietly rehearsing the loss before it's even occurred. This grief doesn't protect you from eventual loss. It doesn't make the real ending, whenever it comes, hurt any less. All it does is steal the days you actually have, replacing presence with a kind of walking sorrow that has no reason to exist yet. If you've been carrying this kind of advanced grief, it's worth asking yourself what it's actually protecting you from, because the honest answer is usually nothing. It's not softening a future blow. It's simply taking today's joy and spending it on a loss that hasn't happened, might not happen for a long time, and cannot be prevented through worry, regardless of how much energy you pour into it. Impermanence isn't the enemy of love. It's actually what gives love its weight, its urgency, its meaning. If nothing ever changed, if everyone you loved was guaranteed to remain exactly as they are forever, love would lose something essential, the preciousness, that comes from knowing this moment, this exact conversation, this exact laugh across the table, is not guaranteed to repeat itself indefinitely. The mountain's slow reshaping is not a tragedy, it's simply the shape of existence, the same shape your relationships live inside, whether you accept it or fight it. And the people who learn to love inside that truth, rather than against it, are usually the ones who end up experiencing the deepest, most present, most alive kind of love there is. Not despite impermanence, but because they finally stopped wasting their days fighting something that was never going to lose. This doesn't mean you stop caring about the future, or stop hoping things last, or stop working toward a life together that stretches on for years. Hope and effort are not the same thing as gripping. You can plant a garden and tend it with real care, watering it, protecting it from frost, doing everything within your power to help it thrive, while still understanding that you cannot control the weather, the seasons, or the eventual nature of all growing things to change with time. That's not resignation, that's wisdom. It's the difference between tending something with open hands and trying to freeze it in place with clenched ones. The mountain doesn't stop being a mountain just because the wind is shaping it. And your love doesn't stop being real, or worth fighting for, or worth tending carefully, just because it exists inside the same current of change that moves through everything else alive in this world. Loving without owning. Somewhere along the way, love got confused with ownership. It happened slowly, over generations, woven into the language people use without even noticing what that language actually implies. Mine. You belong to me. I own your heart. Words that sound romantic on the surface, whispered in moments of tenderness, written into songs and vows and declarations meant to express devotion. But listen closely to what's actually being said underneath the romance, and you'll hear a quiet violence carried inside those words, because nothing that breathes can truly belong to anyone, not fully, not permanently. Not in the way a possession belongs to its owner, sitting quietly on a shelf, waiting to be picked up or put down according to someone else's will. A person is not a possession, no matter how much love you feel toward them, no matter how deeply intertwined your lives have become. They are a living, changing, choosing being, with their own inner world that will never be fully visible to you, their own thoughts that exist independently of your relationship, their own capacity to grow in directions you didn't plan for and might not always understand. The moment you try to own a person, you stop loving who they actually are and start loving who they're useful for you to be, a role they play in your life, a source of comfort or validation or security, rather than a whole, separate human being who happens to have chosen to walk alongside you. This shift is subtle, and it rarely announces itself clearly. It shows up in small demands that feel reasonable in the moment, but add up to something possessive over time. It shows up in jealousy, dressed up as care, in controlling someone's friendships out of a claim to their loyalty, in expecting someone to shrink parts of themselves because those parts don't fit neatly into the role you need them to play. It shows up in language like, "How could you do this to me?" Turning someone else's independent choice into a personal betrayal, as if their life were meant to revolve entirely around your comfort. None of this usually starts with cruelty. It starts with fear, the same fear we've been circling this whole time, the fear that if you don't hold on tightly enough, claim ownership firmly enough, you'll lose what you're afraid to lose. But ownership was never actually protection. It was just another version of the closed fist, squeezing water until nothing is left to hold. Real love releases the leash it never should have held in the first place. This is a hard sentence to sit with if you've spent years believing that possessiveness is simply a sign of how much someone matters to you. But consider what a leash actually does. It restricts movement. It signals control. It exists because the person holding it doesn't trust the one on the other end to stay without being physically restrained from leaving. Is that really what you want love to look like? A relationship held together by restriction instead of by genuine choice, renewed freely, again and again. Real love says, "I choose you, again, today," instead of, "You are mine, forever, no matter what." Notice the difference in the weight of these two statements. The first one is alive. It requires something from you every single day: attention, effort, honesty, presence. It cannot be taken for granted because it has to be renewed, which means it stays vibrant instead of going stale the way things do when we assume they'll simply always be there because we've claimed them once. The second statement, "You are mine, forever, no matter what," sounds committed on the surface, but it actually removes the need for ongoing choice. It treats love as a fact established once and never revisited, rather than a living thing that requires daily tending. One is a living gift, renewed constantly, offered fresh each day, rather than assumed to remain simply because it was declared once in the past. The other is a cage dressed up in wedding vows and promises, a claim staked once and then defended, rather than continually earned. This distinction matters enormously for how a relationship actually feels to live inside. A relationship built on daily choice has room to breathe. Both people know they are there because they want to be, not because they are trapped by an old declaration or a fear of what leaving would cost them. There's a kind of humility built into this way of loving. The humility of knowing that you cannot actually guarantee someone will stay, that the only thing within your control is how well you love them today, and that trying to control tomorrow through possessive claims will never actually secure it. A relationship built on ownership, by contrast, often feels heavier the longer it lasts, because the claim replaces the choosing. People start relating to each other as fixtures rather than as living participants, and the relationship slowly hollows out from the inside, even while the outer structure, the marriage, the years together, the shared home, remains intact. Loving without owning also means allowing someone the full dignity of their own inner life. It means not needing to know every thought that crosses their mind, not needing access to every private conversation, not treating their need for space or solitude as a threat to be managed. This can feel counterintuitive if you've learned to associate closeness with total transparency, total access, total merging of two lives into one. But real intimacy doesn't require the erasure of individual boundaries. It actually depends on those boundaries remaining intact, because two whole people choosing closeness will always create something richer than two people who have dissolved into each other out of fear of being separate. There's a kind of respect embedded in loving without owning that's easy to overlook, because it doesn't look as dramatic as grand romantic gestures. It looks like trusting someone with their own decisions, even ones you might not have made yourself. It looks like supporting a dream that takes them somewhere you can't fully follow, without treating that dream as a betrayal of what you have together. It looks like allowing someone to change, to grow into a person slightly different from who they were when you first fell in love, without demanding they stay frozen in the shape that first made you feel secure. This kind of respect doesn't come naturally to a mind shaped by fear. It has to be practiced, chosen deliberately, especially in moments when the instinct to claim, to control, to restrict, rises up and insists it's protecting the relationship. Loving without owning is, in many ways, the final unlearning required to hold love the way it was always meant to be held, not gripped, not claimed, not caged, but offered freely, and trusted to be met with an equally free choice in return. Here is the quiet thunder, the moment that actually changes something. You were never meant to hold on to love. You were only ever meant to hold it, gently, for as long as it's here, the way you'd hold sunlight in your palm, knowing it will move, knowing it will pass through your fingers eventually, and choosing to feel its warmth fully anyway, instead of mourning its departure before it's even left. That's the secret nobody wants to hear, because it sounds like it's asking you to accept loss before it happens. But it's not asking that. It's asking you to stop prepaying grief on a debt that isn't due yet. It's asking you to spend today's love today, instead of hoarding it out of fear for a tomorrow that hasn't come. So here's where we land, back at that 2 a.m. moment we started with. The fear that kept you staring at the ceiling, running through every way you could lose someone. That fear was never proof of your love. It was the weight you were carrying instead of the love itself. And the moment you set that bag down, even just for today, even just for this one conversation, this one hug, this one quiet evening, you get to actually feel what you were always trying to protect in the first place. Loving without the fear of losing was never about loving less carefully. It was about finally holding love the way it was always meant to be held. Open palms, steady hands, present eyes, so that whether someone stays for a lifetime or for a single season, you were fully there for every second you had them, instead of only half there, bracing for the end. If this spoke to something in you, subscribe. There's more of this waiting for you.